Now, so you've got these 11 companies. The Abbott Labs,
Yep.
Circuit City, Fannie Mae, Gillette, Kimberly-Clark, which is a great study.
Yeah.
Kroger, Nucor, Philip Morris, Walgreens. Get this about Walgreens. From 1975 to 2002, Walgreens appreciated in the New York Stock Exchange better than Intel.
Yeah, if you put
Who would have known?
That's right.
Walgreens, a drugstore.
That's right. And the wonderful thing about it is, if Walgreens can do it, anyone should be able to do it.
Because they're doing something very basic.
Very basic, and before that they were completely, oppressively, depressingly mediocre.
Your first conclusion. The first thing you think of, okay, I know the secret. I guarantee you what you found in this book, that there was a shining knight. Somewhere, some charismatic, brilliant, determined savior arrived at the doorstep of Walgreens and said, I'm here, we're off to greatness.
Yeah. Well, a few things from the data. Number one, over 90% of the CEOs that made this happen were insiders. 3 of them were family members. They came from deep inside the company. 2/3 of the comparison companies, the companies were same industry, tried to do it but failed, tried outsiders. So first, the whole idea that we need to look out there for the great heroic savior to come riding in and make our companies great is simply not supported by the evidence. If you're an outsider, you can still do it, but it's statistically more difficult. Second, we found that the variable of things like charisma, charismatic presence, to be negatively correlated with the ability to make companies go from good to great. I've come to see charisma as like any other handicap. It's like a limp or a lisp. You can overcome it with conscious attention and still build a great company.
By what? By constantly saying, don't focus the attention on me, focus it on this company.
Yes, because think about it this way. Back in Built to Last, we wrote about the difference between people who build clocks and people who tell time. A lot of entrepreneurs are time tellers. They are the single great person who can tell the time, and as so long as they are there to tell the time, everything is fine. But when they go away, there's no clock that can tell the time without them. And in Good to Great, we found a similar analogy to that. We found in the Good to Great companies these, what we call level 5 leaders, but they built this great executive team. And over in the comparison companies, we found something called a genius with 1,000 helpers. And this genius with 1,000 helpers basically really didn't have a company. Yeah. They were a genius. They had all this help to implement, to allow them to paint on the great canvas of corporate life. Yeah. And the problem with the genius with 1,000 helper model is that it also goes hand in hand often with charisma, because you have the genius with 1,000 helpers who charismatically motivates all the helpers to do what needs to be done. That is not building a great company. That is simply being a charismatic leader with a lot of help.
Because when the charismatic leader dies, goes away, leaves...
Right, or ceases to be a genius.
Or ceases to be a genius. Right. The gene just goes away.
Right, yeah. right, exactly.
Hello, my gene, where is it? I had it yesterday.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's interesting. You take the case of Lee Iacocca. I mean, here is our consummate example of the great sort of towering, charismatic, genius leader. But if you look closely, Chrysler was a comparison company in our study. It went from good to great for about 6 years. But at the end of Iacocca's tenure, Chrysler was almost back to where it had started.
Before he left.
Before he left. And so what you have is this, he came in as the great leader, but then everything kind of depended on Lee, the man, the dictator himself, the great disciplinarian. About halfway through his tenure, he stopped making genius decisions. He went off in aircraft companies and did the Maserati cars and did all these things that were basically wrong decisions. But guess what? If you lead with charisma, you can convince everybody that you are right through the power of your personality. If you don't have a charisma, you have to win the argument based on the facts and the merits of the argument.
And performance.
And performance.
Yeah. So in the end, it becomes the company.
It becomes the company. And therein is the kind of critical thing that we saw. It's really not sort of charisma versus not. I mean, I think Sam Walton was a charismatic who transcended that variable to become a great company.
He overcame his charisma.
He overcame his charisma and built a great company. He was one of the classic level 5s. Here's the essential variable.
Before we go, what's a level 5?
Okay. How do I want to put that in shorthand? We had a great debate on the team. Can I just tell a quick story about on the team? Our whole team process was one of search for answers, infused with data, and then great debate about what that data means. And I had this wonderful group of people who worked with me. We came to call ourselves the Chimps. And we'd have these raucous meetings, and ultimately, they were people who were not loyal to me, they were loyal to the data. That was the kind of person I wanted. And one day I walked into the research team meeting, and they'd all joined hands. And I looked at them and I thought, well, that's sort of different. And they said, today is the day, Jim, we've decided to tell you that you are wrong. Okay?
And we've locked hands.
We've locked hands, and we're not leaving here until you accept the data. And they said, our read of the data is that leadership really matters in these transformations. And I pushed back and I said, look at the comparisons. You can't tell me that Lee Iacocca and Stanley Galt and Jack Eckert and the people in the comparison companies weren't also leaders. Leadership is a non-variable. It's our great plug figure for everything we don't understand. Leadership is not the answer. They pushed back and they said, we found, as we look at the data, that the leaders in the good to great companies were all cut from the same cloth. And it was cloth that was different than the comparisons. So what we found is we saw leadership as a level of sort of hierarchy, if you will, kind of individual capabilities, team capabilities, management capabilities, leadership capabilities at level 4. But there was this extra dimension that these people had, and we didn't know what else to call them, so we just called them level 5s. Yeah. And the sort of Iacocca's and all those stop at 4. And here's the essence of the 5. The 5 is ambitious, first and foremost, for the cause, for the company, for the work, not him or herself. And they have the will to do whatever is necessary to make good on the ambition for that cause. That is the essence of a level 5.
Does this translate to other areas of endeavor? Mm-hmm. Writers, painters, athletes, generals?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what's interesting is the level 5s are often the ones who they sit in the background and don't often get a lot of the credit, but without them, the great things wouldn't have happened. Take, for example, the world of generals. One of the most understudied great generals is George Marshall, who was the classic level 5 in World War II, behind the scenes, and didn't take the European command because what was needed was for him, for the ambition, for the cause, was to be back home. You take a look in the world of presidents. Our greatest, one of our greatest presidents is Lincoln. He's a consummate level 5. Lincoln was ambitious first and foremost for the nation. He could have had an easier life of it if he would have just basically kind of let the Confederacy go. But Lincoln's view was, I am ambitious for the nation first and foremost. And if 600,000 people have to die in order for the nation to live, then 600,000 people will die for the nation to live. That, to me, is what the level 5 is. And in the end, it wasn't about Lincoln. It was about the nation.
The hardest, it must be, what was the conviction that made Lincoln understand that? I mean, was it something in Lincoln's DNA a long time ago that made him have that capacity to understand so profoundly what was at stake? You know, it's one thing to have a company, it's another thing to be able to say, I'm sacrificing not a profit and loss statement, but 650,000 lives because this is so crucial, and to understand the significance of the moment.
It's very interesting in our research looking at the level 5s where I studied their history, their own personal history as much as I could. And I look at and I'll answer your question by looking at the corporate leaders, because that's where I can go to the data. There's a fascinating thing that happens. They tend to get there by one of 3 ways. Some seem to have it right from the beginning. You know, they were like the quiet, understated high school quarterback that never took much of the credit, but they won state championships, right? There were some that were like that from the beginning. There were some who had a pivotal event in their life that humbled them and made them seem small. There was one fellow in our study, Darwin Smith, who contracted cancer upon becoming chief executive of Kimberly-Clark. And when all of a sudden he realized, I may not live that long, he realized that in the grand scheme of things, he's really small. And the question became, what am I going to build? What am I going to contribute that is larger and is not about me? Because I will not even exist. And then you go to a third group, which are people where the burden of their responsibility extracts it from them. I look at Sam Walton over the course of his career, and I don't think he started at a level 5. But I think when he got out towards the end of his life, and he had this thing called Walmart that he built that employed all these people, and they have like 1.3 million people, all of a sudden he realized that this is no longer about Sam. And my responsibility is ambition for this thing has to go on beyond me. I've seen that as people go through progression, that the burden of responsibility extracts level 5-ness of them. I think that even happened to Churchill in the Second World War.
But there is also George Marshall, in terms of historical context, who was a classic level 5. Yet when a great question came to the nation, which was Harry Truman had to decide about Israel, Marshall was in a competition and advocated against it for reasons he thought were in the national interest and his own wisdom. But he was wrong on that issue. So that doesn't say anything other than you can be a level 5
and be wrong.
And be wrong,
yes.
And be wrong on a great issue.
That's right.
And in fact, the reasons that he had advocated not recognizing Israel might very well have been, in his own mind, right.
What's interesting about the level 5s is how they build a system where they are right more often than not. And part of the reason they do is because they are people who realize that they're not going to think of themselves as the genius with helpers. And it's interesting how they went about their building and their management. As you think about Lincoln and the generals, their first question was not, what are we going to do? It was always, who? They were people who always said, my first question, my first response to every challenge is not what, but who. Who am I going to involve in this? Who would be the right people to advise me? Who would be the right people to have on the bus? Who's on the bus? And it's interesting, throughout our study, we noticed this pattern where the good, great CEOs, somebody would come in and say, so what are you going to do? And they would say, I don't know. It's the wrong question.
Who's going to do it?
Right. I'm not going to figure out where to drive this bus until I figured out who should be on the bus, who should be off the bus, and who should be in what seats. And once I've got that who resolved, then as the bus goes down the road, we'll get reasonably good rights, because right what's. The issue is this. The world constantly changes. So your only insurance that you can adapt to that changing world is not that you have the right what, but that you have the right who's.
In looking for two things. One, leadership. You believe what about leadership? What is your definition of leadership? And what point was your group making with you, one more time, about leadership? And have you changed over the course of this book, or even today, after this book has been out for a year, about your sense of leadership?
I'm a recovering leadership atheist.
You were a non-believer.
I've always believed...
Oh, you agnostic?
No, I was pretty much an atheist.
You were an atheist,
leadership. Yeah. I genuinely believed that, we're pretty close to it, that leadership is our great plug figure for everything we don't understand.
Right. If we're not there, it's because we didn't have a leader.
Right, exactly. If we are there, it's because we had a leader.
Right. And the only thing we need is a leader.
And all we need is a leader, right? And if things went wrong, then it must be the wrong leader.
Right.
And it just gets in the way of our understanding. And I picture it as like back in the 1600s, whenever we didn't understand why an earthquake happened. We'd say, well, God did it. Why did the plague break out? Well, God did it. And then we began to understand physics and biology and chemistry and plate tectonics. And now when we have an earthquake, we don't say God did it. We look at plate tectonics. And that God was our great plug figure of the 1600s. Leadership in the world of the social sciences is our great plug figure of the 20th century. And the more we use that plug figure, the more we will not understand the other variables. So at the beginning of the research study, I came and I asserted in a very, I guess, counter to curiosity approach, we will not have a leadership answer, which is not exactly conducive to freedom of thought.
Or democracy.
Or democracy. But fortunately in our environment, the data wins, not me. And where I have changed is to come to see that it is not leadership per se that matters, but the type and the inner integrity and the inner ambition and the inner will of a particular type of leader. That's what really matters. They come in lots of packages and sizes and shapes and genders and whatever, but it's not about me, it's about the cause, and I have the will on behalf of the cause. And that's why you almost never hear of these people. It's fascinating when we discover them. I thought these must be rare freaks of nature. And then I started getting emails from people all over the country saying, I've worked with a level 5 who was my platoon commander, or my high school basketball coach, she was fabulous, or somebody'd write about somebody running a part of the New York Times. And I began to realize that level 5 leadership is in fact the mortar that holds the bricks of society together. It's out there all over the place, but it's like that picture of the vase and the two faces. We keep looking at the wrong kind of leaders and thinks that's what makes it great, which means we ignore the level 5.
Okay, but let me just understand this. Suppose I would have come to you before I've had this conversation, before I read this book, before I'd studied you. Yeah. I would have said that, there is nothing wrong with ego. And there's not even anything wrong with ego for self. There's nothing wrong with that. It does not necessarily have to be counterproductive. But you seem to believe otherwise. That if you care about self, then you can't be level 5.
I'll put it this way.
It's different than stifling charisma.
Right, exactly. I don't think these people had zero ego. I think what they did was they transferred their ego into ambition for something larger than themselves. And that, let me give it a recent example of a shift towards level 5. I look at, say, Lou Gerstner when he came into IBM. Now, I think my own read, I could be wrong, is that for most of Gerstner's career, he was not level 5. He was very much ambitious, first and foremost, for Lou Gerstner.
Yes.
And the steps along the way were about Lou, pretty much, maybe exclusively.
Where does Lou find the best opportunity?
For Lou.
Right, for Lou, yeah.
And then he sort of drops in on that same model into this CEO-ship of this thing called IBM. And as he said at the end of his tenure there, he said, something happened that I didn't expect. I fell in love with IBM.
And IBM is bigger than me.
That's right. And all of a sudden, it shifted to, I have a responsibility to reignite greatness in this institution. It'd be like if you became president of Harvard or something. At some point, if you're president of Harvard and it's about you, you shouldn't be president of Harvard. And there are certain...
That resonates for...
Yeah. And there are certain institutions, and I think that what happened is in that case, it shifted. It's not that he had no ego, that he was a completely sort of weak, self-effacing person. But where the ego was channeled was into IBM, not Lou, during that phase of his tenure.
Is this something that the military has in their DNA?
I have a habit of hiring Marines. It's a good question. It's the death marching part.
Yeah. And the Stockdale part.
And the Stockdale part, which we may want to talk about, because that's actually really central to what we found.
Yeah.
My researchers that have been Marines resonate a lot with what we found in this study, particularly when they say that those who don't make it through the real screening process are the ones who in boot camp only watch out for themselves, and the ones who make it through are the ones who figure out they only make it through by watching out for each other. But they also make clear that it's not a matter of teaching people that. It's finding people who can do that.
Well, maybe that goes back to choosing the who.
Exactly.
The people you choose to get on the bus with you if you're going to run whatever corporation.